Hi everyone, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. The Women's Prize shortlist is very soon to be announced, and I've been working my way through as many of the longlisted books as I could, mainly to join in with the fun, but also so that I could have a go at predicting what's going to make the cut and be in with a shot at winning the entire prize. I'm not as prolific a reader as many folks out there, but I have managed to read 11 of the 16 longlisted books, which I'm really happy with. And in this video, I'm going to run through each of those and give a short review before sharing with you my predicted shortlist. But first, some stats for all the nerds out there like me. Of the 11 books I read, I gave one book 2 stars, I gave 3 books 3 stars, 6 books got 4 stars, and then only 1 got 5 stars from me. Obviously, star ratings are completely subjective, but it's a nice way to track how we feel about our reading experiences of the book. And my average rating for the books I have read was about 3.6, which I think is pretty good going. If you're interested in how I read these books, I read 5 in hardback, 1 in paperback, 4 I read as an ebook and 1 as an audiobook. I do tend to prefer physical books. There's just something about that tactile feeling of turning a page that appeals to me. But I found it really useful actually to have a mixture of mediums here, and that helped me get through more books than I otherwise would have. What I'll do is run through the books that I didn't read and then the ones that I did read in the order that I read them. I'll rattle through the ones that I didn't read really quickly just to tell you why I didn't prioritise them. The first book I didn't get to was Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I do really want to read this. I am very excited about it. I've got this beautiful copy, but I decided not to prioritise it for 2 reasons. One is that it is pretty chunky, and in the time that I would have spent reading this, I probably wouldn't have been able to get to like 3 or 4 of the other books because there are quite a lot of short titles on the long list. The second reason, and this is a spoiler, I think this is going to make the shortlist, so I will be reading it over the coming months anyway. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. Then we have Pod and The Dog of the North. Both of these just didn't really appeal to me from the long list. I knew that I wouldn't be able to get through everything, and I wanted to spend time reading the books I was most excited about. And sadly, these were just bottom of the pile for me. Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow is a book that I'm not really against reading. Indeed, it sounds like a premise that I'd be really interested in. But the author's shenanigans make me a little bit disinclined to care about getting to it, so I haven't. And then finally, Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes is another one that I would happily read, but I've not really been on the Greek myth retelling bandwagon, and so it just didn't creep up my list in time. And with that, you will be glad to know I'm now going to shut up about books I haven't read and tell you about the ones that I have read. Starting with I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. This is our messy millennial woman book. It seems to divide people, but I'm not sure why, because I think this is a stunner. It is an excellent, acerbic book about a woman having an affair with, to be quite honest, a shit of a man who is referred to as the man I want to be with. He's cheating on his girlfriend with our protagonist, but also openly in other relationships too, and he talks about them. He seems to think that his openness means that he is not a shit, but he is, in fact, still a shit. One of the women that he is in a relationship with is this attractive, blonde, white influencer our narrator calls the woman I'm obsessed with. And the narrator orbits this woman's life more and more closely, getting into these awkward, cringe-inducing moments, though I stress, not in a farcical way. This is all more blackly comic than slapstick. One particularly funny highlight was when she joins an Instagram live that the woman she's obsessed with is doing with a fellow influencer, and then very awkwardly calls them out for not listening to each other. It is really specifically funny, but also works as a general criticism for how we conduct ourselves on social media, where we broadcast more than we listen. And I found that again and again throughout this novel. It has an addictive, propulsive style. It has very short, almost vignette-like chapters. And while the plot doesn't have any particular drive, I did find it really addictive to read, and it was a bit like doom scrolling through the news or swiping through social media. And I really loved that mirroring of form and subject. It has so much to say about privilege, race, social media, sex, power. It even mentions book prizes. There's one particular chapter called There's No Business Like that in a few short pages delivers this incredibly powerful take on what is asked of artists from underrepresented backgrounds, having to give themselves up to these predefined identities and deliver what's expected, all in order to get ahead and get nominated for a prestigious prize. I've seen some comparisons with No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, but for me this just blows it out of the water. I found that book really smug and a little bit too inside baseball on Twitter, whereas this, for me, had so much more to say, such a wider appeal, and I absolutely loved it. This was my 5-star read of the long list. The next book I read was Children of Paradise by Camilla Gradova. This is set in a cinema. Our main character, Holly, wanders into the cinema looking for a job and gets one. At first, she's a bit of an outsider to the clique of the other workers, a band of misfits, if you will. But slowly she is accepted and her life becomes intertwined with theirs. What drives the plot is what happens really to the cinema, which is eventually bought by a bigger chain, and the book morphs into an often very funny critique of capitalism, and particularly its impact on workers and their well-being. In some strange way, it felt a little bit to me at times like Harry Potter, particularly in The Order of the Phoenix when Dolores Umbridge takes over. I got a lot of mileage out of the Umbridge character, Andrew, who's this really fussy manager. It is blackly comic and it contains some descriptions of bodily fluids, which I know will be a turn-off for some readers, but to me it never felt excessive like it has in some other books. Discomfort of evening. I actually felt like this was described as really strange, but then didn't quite deliver the level of strange that I was expecting and open to. It could have been weirder, it could have veered more into that George Saunders territory, whose work I think does an even better job at skewering rampant capitalism. Nevertheless, overall I did really like it, but I think it benefited a little bit from being one of the earlier books that I read from the list. I did give it 4 stars, but I do wonder if my feelings about it might wane over time. Next is Curse Bread by Sophie McIntosh. I actually went to see Sophie talk about this book and she was absolutely lovely. So I do feel a little bit bad saying that this is probably the one I read that I enjoyed the least. This was my 2-star read. This is about a woman called Elodie who lives in an unnamed French village, which at the start of the book we know has gone through some traumatic mass poisoning, and that's based on a real life event that happened in the 1950s. This fictionalised version of those events is told across 2 time periods. One where we get snippets of Elodie's life after the poisoning, and then the meat of the book is before all this happens, when 2 Americans arrive in the village and we see Elodie's interactions with them, and in particular her growing obsession with the wife of the ambassador, Violet. I think this would work for a certain type of reader. The writing is very poetic, it's very beautiful, and it is very erotically charged. However, my excitement about this book was mainly to do with the setup and the poisoning. I was really interested in that mass hysteria and shared trauma, and I didn't think that was particularly explored. It did go a little bit further in hinting at what was going on than I expected. There was an undercurrent of some conspiracy, but for much of this book it is just slow and, to be honest, for me, painful build-up. It felt a little theatrical, especially with most characters not having names and being referred to as their jobs or their relationships to one another, like the butcher or the grocer's wife. And the setting of the village felt more like backdrop than a real place. The much more interesting aspect of the story for me was in the background, and I was reading about Elodie and Violet's relationship to get to the other stuff, but that wasn't the core of the novel, and so it was just a bit unsatisfying. There is a section towards the end where we get sight of some of the madness that goes on, but it's one of the chapters looking back, and so it feels like there's quite a lot of distance. I think this would have been a more successful book had these stories of what happened been peppered throughout the novel, or if Sophie had just ditched the entire historical event and focused on the erotic obsession, if that's what she wanted to write. And I think that would have allowed the book to be marketed differently and find the right group of readers for it. Overall, not a great one for me. Next, I read Wandering Souls by Cecil Pinn. This is the story of 3 siblings, Anne, Tan and Min, who flee Vietnam. Their father has made plans for the whole family to emigrate to the US, and the siblings depart on one boat while the rest of the family depart on another. It's not really a spoiler to say that the other boat sadly doesn't make it, and so the 3 kids are left orphaned and stuck in a facility in Hong Kong. Although they plan to go to the US, they end up in Margaret Thatcher's UK, first in an immigration centre, then in an apartment in London. The book mainly focuses on Anne, the eldest sibling, and we get a very close perspective of her as she's forced to grow up and basically become a parent to her younger brothers. In between the main chapters, we get these interjections from other voices, including one of the siblings that drowned. we get newspaper articles, we get missives between politicians. And there is this metaphysical aspect that I really liked, with the author of the story reflecting on its writing as they're writing it, what to include, what to leave out, what to sort of make a bigger point about. At first, I thought this was Cecil Pinn herself inserting her own voice into the book, which I was really excited by. Sadly, it didn't turn out to be quite that, but I still thought it was quite impactful. This was a real surprise for me, and I absolutely loved it. I felt very emotionally invested in these characters and their story. The writing is admittedly pretty simple, and I can imagine at some point the publishers wondering if it could be edited and repackaged to be a YA novel. I'm glad they didn't do that though, because I think this is a really impressive debut, and I really enjoyed the experience of reading it. The next book I read from the long list was Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks. People have really, really loved this one. Sadly, I wasn't quite as taken with it, but it's definitely an enjoyable novel. We follow a woman called Yamei, and we start out in 1970s London, deep in the dub scene. In its opening chapters, there are these really engaging accounts of Yamei and her friends going to this underground club in a crypt and having a pretty sweaty, raucous time. She meets a man called Moose, and for a while it felt like this might be a romance story, but it's not, and the plot twists and turns and takes her to Bristol and then to Jamaica. The writing is very poetic. There are so many rhymes and half rhymes littered throughout the prose that it gives it a really sing-song quality, which I really enjoyed, and I imagine the audiobook for this is fantastic. But while I did enjoy the rhythm of the prose, there are quite a few parts that are sung, and to be totally honest, I struggle with that generally in books. I can't hear the music and I tend to glaze over a little bit. I've never once laid eyes on one of the poems in Lord of the Rings. I just glance right past it. The book is incredibly evocative of the dub scene, and it captures a sense of time and place really effectively. It has this specificity that you only get through like primary experience, so I can tell that Jacqueline Crooks is drawing on her own experiences. That said, I did find the plot a little too melodramatic for my tastes. I am torn on saying this because of Jacqueline Crooks sort of drawing on her own experiences, but the stakes felt so high all the time, and the despair feels so rock bottom that I just frequently didn't believe it. It also felt a little bit long. I felt like I was really wading through it at times. I don't think this benefited from me trying to read it too fast, but that's on me as a reader. I did really like the character of Yamei. I thought the ending was really satisfying, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see this pop up again and again on book prize lists. The sixth book that I read was Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This is also set in the 1970s, but in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Our protagonist is Kushla. She's a Catholic primary school teacher who also works in her brother's pub to help out. Kushla meets a man called Michael at the pub, a much older Protestant man, and they have a bit of a Romeo and Juliet forbidden affair, only with more adultery. It's got a very simple writing style, and I think that really worked. It accentuated what people endured as normal during the Troubles. There's like a good moment when she visits Dublin and she holds out her bag to be inspected as she goes into, I think it's a theatre, and she's just told, no, that's not necessary, we don't do that. And the combination of that sort of quite flat writing style plus these moments that surprised you, I think really helped to build this picture of the things that people just accept and adapt to. And it's quite reminiscent of the sort of things we did during COVID, like wearing masks or queuing up at the supermarket for an hour to get in. One drawback was that the romance, to me, wasn't romantic in the slightest. Michael was presented as this very nice, amiable, moral man, but he seemed like he was completely taking advantage of Kushla, yet another man who was just a bit of a shit, basically. The relationship between Kushla and one of the boys in her class, Davy, however, was much more interesting to me. I think it had more to say about the workings of the religious divide at that time and in that place. So Kushla was trying to help out this kid at her school, and she gets castigated for doing that, and her family suffers. I kind of knew where this was going from about the halfway mark, but that didn't impact my enjoyment at all. It takes a bit of time to get going, but I think it really zips along in the second half. And I really enjoyed the experience of reading it. This is another one that I don't think I'd have read if it hadn't been on the long list. It looked to me like a book that might bore me. So it was a real surprise that I was actually gripped and really loved it. Next we have The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, a very, very aesthetically pleasing book. But first things first, I am confused about why this book is so big. Apparently the US edition is about 300 pages, but in the UK the font is absolutely massive and it pushes this book to over 400 pages. If I were a cynical man, and I am, I'd guess that it was to make it seem longer so that they could charge £25 for this hardback. And I think there's a £75 crazy fancy exclusive edition, but that's not Maggie's fault. That's a publisher thing. This story is about Lucrezia de Medici, who was a real historical figure that was married to the Duke of Ferrara when she was 15, and a year later she died. We see Lucrezia across two time periods, one when she's been married a year and she's facing mortal peril, and then another that starts with her as a young child and tells the story of her life as she grows up in her family home and then is promised and married off to Alonso. And that timeline sort of catches up with the other one, which is seen as the present day. I should probably couch my comments in the fact that I recently read Hamnet and found it incredibly overwritten, with every point hammered home like 3 times per sentence. The good news is I didn't think the same was true here. I liked it a lot more than Hamnet and I found myself really engaged throughout, which may be to do with expectations, but it really zipped along and I thought the pacing was much better. That's partly down to the structure and the perspective. Hamnet was a book of 2 halves, before and after, while this is more like a book of 2 strands, 2 intertwining threads. And because we're following Lucrezia the entire time, we're not wading through her story, just waiting for her to die like I felt we were with Hamnet. I wasn't desperate to get on with it and see what happened after the inevitable. The drama here is not the dread of knowing and wondering how the characters are going to deal with it, but instead wondering how we got to this point and how it's all going to unfold. But just because I liked it better, it does not mean I loved it. I have a bit of a problem, and it might be a me problem, with historical fiction where you have a third-party omniscient narrator, but it thickly piles on this old-timey cadence and vocabulary. Everyone's wearing shifts and looking at each other's countenances rather than their faces. It just feels quite fake to me, and it often comes across as generically old language that could be from the 1890s as much as from the 1560s. These people would have been speaking some old version of Italian anyway, so it just feels a bit weird to me. I might be completely wrong about this, but that's just how it feels. Overall, it is a well-told story, and I did find the characters interesting to read about, pretty layered and believable by modern standards. And that by modern standards is quite an important point. This is probably best read as a feminist retelling more than an attempt at a realistic historical account. I don't think Lucrezia necessarily would have thought and felt and behaved the way that she does in the book in real life, but then history is all open to interpretation. I did find it really engaging, really well plotted, it was well paced, and it has, I want to say a good, but it's more like an interesting ending. I'm not sure if I felt it was just, but I won't say any more in case you want to read this one. Only 4 more books to go, we're nearly there, and the last physical one that I have is Homesick by Jennifer Croft. Croft is primarily a translator, and she's previously won the International Booker Prize for her translation of Olga Tokarczuk's Flights. This is her first novel, and the book has a really interesting backstory, maybe even more interesting than the novel itself. So it was originally written as a novel in Spanish called Serpientes y Escaleras, which means snakes and ladders. Then I believe she started to tell the same story in English as a series of blog posts. Then these blog posts were reworked into a long-form English language work called Homesick. This was marketed as a memoir in the US, and it included a bunch of photographs, but then the photographs were removed, some chapters were reordered and reworked slightly, and it was released and marketed as a novel by Charco Press in the UK. Whew, I think I need to read a book about the writing and release of this book. Could be a bestseller, who knows. Homesick, however, is about sisters Amy and Zoe growing up in rural Oklahoma. It's about the relationship between the sisters who have very different personalities. Zoe is the younger and is a bit of a free spirit. She's emotionally sensitive, a little bit dependent on her sister, while Amy's quite headstrong and independent. And although she really loves her sister, she is keen to carve her own path. It's another book with fairly simple language, but I thought their relationship and their differences were really well drawn, without flowery sentences. The matter-of-fact approach combined with a very much show-don't-tell ethos and its short chapters was really effective in making this a pretty propulsive read. There's actually quite a lot of white space on the page, and we jump between these vignettes of different things happening. You're often dropped into the middle of things and you just need to work out what's going on. Some of it is quite harrowing, but it's really effective. And in particular, I thought the way that Zoe's health problems are portrayed was very real. It was slightly emotionally numb, and I think that captured Amy's perspective on it in a really convincing way. I enjoyed reading this. I'm not sure it felt massively substantial compared to some of the other books on the list. And I do wonder if it does work better as a memoir. There's so much mentioned about the photographs that Amy takes throughout the novel, and I think the story would have been elevated if I could also see the photos, which American readers get to. So yeah, mixed feelings on this. I liked it, but I didn't love it. Okay, next is Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, and I really enjoyed this one. This story follows Zora, a 55-year-old woman in Sarajevo, and we join her in the build-up to the siege of the city that took place in the early 90s in the war that happened in Yugoslavia. We start off with some immediate drama. Some people have forcibly moved into her mother's apartment as it's currently empty while she stays with Zora over winter because she doesn't have appropriate heating or something like that. From there, though, the political situation spirals and Zora is left alone in the city under siege when her husband and mother go to stay with their daughter in England. There is a reason for Zora staying behind. I think it's because she has work and she teaches art and she can't afford to take the time off because she's worried about losing her job. I thought this was an incredibly gripping story. It painted such a vivid, painful picture of how lives can slide into a terrible, horrible new normal. If Trespasses was a strong account of lives where violence and segregation has already taken hold, this was an amazing account of how you get there and how you endure it. I really liked that this was from the perspective of a woman in her 50s, which feels like a surprisingly underrepresented group in fiction considering how many readers are from that demographic. And overall, I found this a really emotionally resonant story. It packed a real punch, and I found myself more heartbroken for Zora than perhaps any of the other characters in any of the books on this long list. There might be something particularly affecting about this just because of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Sadly, I found it all too easy to picture what was going on because I have so many images from the news that I can reference. It's a really beautiful, cracking story. Next we have Glory by No Violet Bulawayo. This is a book that was nominated for the Booker last year, but for some reason I just really was not interested in it. But after some recommendations in the comments on my previous videos, I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Chipo Chung. First off, this is just incredibly narrated. Chung did such a fantastic job, and I think my experience was mostly elevated thanks to her narration. This is a book about a fictional African country called Jidada, with a da and another da, populated by anthropomorphic animals. The use of animals has led to some comparisons with Animal Farm, but this book really isn't anything like Animal Farm. Indeed, multiple times the book itself reads, "This is no Animal Farm." It's less allegorical and a more direct retelling of actual events, many of which seem to come from recent Zimbabwean history. This is a very, very long book. It was a 16-hour audiobook. But the TLDR summary is that the old horse, a dictator that has ruled for 40 years, loses power through a coup, and Jidada is subject to the rule of a new dictator, Tuve, who promises lots but takes more. The style of this book is going to irritate a lot of people. It uses a lot of repetition, which is going to irritate a lot of people. It uses repetition a lot, and that is going to irritate a lot of people. And no, that was not an editing mistake. I was just trying to make my point. Sometimes I think this repetition is effective and it evokes a style we typically see in political rhetoric. Other times it is a bit much. Particularly on audio, it feels like unnecessary padding at times. So like on the written page, you'd be able to spot the repetition, skim it, still get the intended effect, but not have to like read it out. But on the audiobook, that repetition is read out in full every time. And sometimes that was just a bit painful. I think there was one point where I got about 5 minutes of the words "I can't breathe" repeated again and again and again, and I thought my audiobook was broken. And I think that would have been a better, easier experience in a physical book where I could have just glanced across the page. I've seen people say that the characters being animals didn't work for them, and I can sympathise with that. But I think it did work for me for a few reasons. One, it allowed Bulawayo to take some more poetic license with the events and not stick exactly to what happened and instead change things up to make her point. Second, it created space for levity, and this is at times quite a funny book. Otherwise, it might have been a bit more serious and a lot heavier. And third, I think it created this much needed distance between the teller of the story and the story itself. I read this a lot like when someone says, "I've got a friend who has a problem," which might be a very personal or painful one, and it allows them to talk about that without directly admitting that it's them. There were some very funny moments in the book, and there are some very harrowing ones. A particular section in the middle had me like holding my breath, shocked at what was unfolding, and it kind of hits you twice because it's happening with the animals, and then you think this is almost certainly based on a real thing that happened in Zimbabwe. Ultimately, I did give this 4 stars, but I think I probably appreciated it more than I enjoyed it. I feel like I waded through a lot for some very rewarding story beats, but it was very long and I felt that throughout. Okay, the final book that I read from the long list was The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. This is one that I probably would not have read unless it was shortlisted, but I put a poll on my channel and this got more than 50% of the votes. And I tell you what, thank you very much. This was a total surprise and I really, really enjoyed it. It's about a woman called Geeta who lives in a rural Indian village, and she's been living alone for 5 years since her husband disappeared. People seem to think that she killed him, which she doesn't mind too much until other women in the village start coming to ask her for small favours. I thought this was an absolute riot. It is very, very funny. It's a black comedy, at times quite slapstick, but in a really good way. It reminded me of like films like In Bruges, where there was just a lot of silly dialogue amongst all these quite serious themes. And it does cover some serious themes of violence, including sexual violence against women. So just be aware that this isn't a fluffy, heartwarming read. But I really admired how those themes were so deftly threaded into the overall tone of the book without you really seeing the seams between them. I thought it was very impressively and intricately plotted, actually. On the surface, it seems quite simple, but there were a few times where I thought it was going to move in a particular predictable direction, but it didn't, at least not as far as my pea brain was concerned. And I was pleasantly surprised by some of the crumbs that were dropped in plain sight earlier in the novel, setting up twists and turns that came later. I've seen a little bit of criticism that this doesn't completely accurately capture some of the cultural context and plays up to some tired tropes about India, which is a shame, but it's not something that I would have recognised, I think, as I don't have the cultural context myself. And I didn't come away from this with a particularly bad impression of India, only that some equalities exist, as they do in all places. Overall, I really, really enjoyed the ride and I'm glad that I read it. Overall, I have had a real blast reading these books and it has been really, really hard to narrow it down to just 6 to make the shortlist. There are some super interesting, consistent themes throughout this long list, particularly I've noticed around autonomy, and that includes bodily autonomy and how societal expectations can limit women. But specifically, there's so much in these novels about freedom of movement and the claustrophobia of having that movement restricted, or not getting a say over the spaces we move within. And I thought that was really interesting, and so I hope it is well represented in the shortlist. In terms of what I think will be on the shortlist though, I think there are 4 books that I am fairly set on, and those are Demon Copperhead, which has had pretty universal praise at this point, and I hope it's on the shortlist because I want an excuse to read it. I think it's going to be brilliant. I'm a fan. I think I really want to see on the shortlist. For me, this was probably the freshest, most exciting, dynamic book I read from the long list. And I think it would be a crying shame if that wasn't rewarded by it making an appearance on the shortlist. Black Butterflies is another one that I am hoping to see on the shortlist. It's really emotionally powerful. I think it's got so much going for it in the story that it tells. And I think it's very prescient about sort of how history repeats itself given what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. And then Fire Rush is another one that I expect to see on the shortlist, because although it didn't work brilliantly for me, I do see what others see in this book. And I imagine that the judges are going to see this as something maybe a little bit different. It's got a very unique rhythm and tone and voice to it that I think makes it an easy call for the shortlist. The other two books, I'm not so sure. I think it's a toss-up between quite a few. And so I'm just going to guess with my heart. And the two books that I would really like to see make an appearance on the shortlist as well would be Wandering Souls by Cecil Pinn. Just because of how emotionally invested I was, some of the clever things it tries to do with sort of the metafictional side of things. And then the Bandit Queens, which was an absolute surprise to me. And I think it's a different kind of story that I wouldn't usually read, and I'd love to see that rewarded and reach a wider audience. There's not long to go until we'll see if my predictions are correct or not. But either way, it's a really exciting time in prize season, and I'm hoping that with the shortlist announcement, we'll get a big uptick in publicity for the prize and these books will become even more widely read. I don't think I'll do a shortlist reaction video or anything like that, but if Demon Copperhead is on the shortlist, I'll probably do a reading vlog for that one, because it will be quite fun to do, I think. Let me know what your shortlist predictions are in the comments. Do you agree with my picks? Are there any that I've missed that you think are a shoo-in and I'm really missing a trick? If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed and you'd like to see more from me, hit the subscribe button and my videos will start to pop up in your feed. But otherwise, until next time, toodles!